The upscale dining room of Chateau Laurier's Wilfrid's restaurant went completely still the moment the security guard's thick hand came down on the shoulder of the woman sitting quietly at table 14. She had been there for 40 minutes. Her half-eaten plate of Atlantic salmon sat in front of her, her glass of Pinot Gris barely touched. She wore a deep navy blazer over a crisp ivory blouse, and her reading glasses were still perched on her nose when the hand landed, because she had been reviewing a document on her tablet, the kind of quiet, purposeful focus that belonged entirely to a person who had nowhere else to be and no reason to rush. The security guard's name was Dale Furness. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, with a specific brand of confidence that came not from competence, but from the unchallenged daily exercise of minor authority. He had worked the Chateau Laurier beat for 4 years, and in that time he had developed a finely tuned, deeply flawed instinct for who belonged in the building and who did not. The woman at table 14, in his estimation, did not belong. What Furness did not know, could not have known, because he had not bothered to look closely enough, was that the woman whose shoulder he had just gripped was Lieutenant Colonel Adaora Osei-Wentworth of the Canadian Armed Forces, currently on a 48-hour leave pass between a classified logistics briefing at National Defence Headquarters and a flight to CFB Trenton the following morning. She had earned that rank over 22 years of service across 3 continents. She had managed supply chains in Kandahar when the temperature hit 48 degrees and the roads outside the wire were laced with IEDs. She had organised the evacuation of Canadian nationals from a collapsing government in West Africa in under 72 hours. She was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most operationally experienced logisticians in the history of the Royal Canadian Army Corps. She was also, at this particular moment in her evening, trying to finish her salmon in peace. The dining room of Wilfrid's was the kind of place that attracted federal cabinet ministers, senior civil servants, and visiting dignitaries who stayed at the hotel when they needed to be close to Parliament Hill without actually being on it. The ceilings were vaulted and Gothic, the tablecloths were starched linen, and the sommelier knew the provenance of every bottle in the cellar without consulting a list. It was not a place where scenes happened. It was precisely the kind of place where, historically, people who looked like Lieutenant Colonel Osei-Wentworth had been made to feel as though they did not belong, quietly, plausibly, and without leaving fingerprints. Furness leaned down. His voice was low, but not kind. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me." Adaora Osei-Wentworth set her reading glasses on the table. She did not raise her voice. She did not stand. She turned her head slowly and looked at the hand on her shoulder with the particular, measured expression of a person who has spent 2 decades learning exactly how much composure costs and exactly when it is worth spending. "Remove your hand," she said, "and then explain why you're interrupting my dinner." Furness pulled his hand back, but his posture did not change. He was committed now, in the way that small men with large egos become committed to a mistake the moment they realize reversing it would cost them their dignity. "We've had a complaint from another guest," he said. "There's a concern about an individual matching your description who was seen in the East Corridor without a key card. Hotel policy requires me to verify your room booking or ask you to accompany me to the front desk." The table adjacent to Adaora's had gone silent. A federal bureaucrat in a charcoal suit was staring into his risotto with intense concentration, the way people do when they desperately want to be invisible. A woman in her 60s, seated 2 tables over with what appeared to be her daughter, was watching the interaction with poorly concealed alarm. "I am not a hotel guest," Adaora said, her voice carrying the flat, patient precision of someone accustomed to briefing generals. "I am a dinner reservation. Osei-Wentworth, party of 2715. You may verify this with the maître d', whose name, if it helps you, is Martin, and who seated me personally 40 minutes ago. I have not been in the East Corridor. I came through the main entrance, checked my coat, and walked directly to this table." Furness straightened up slightly. The complaint, she suspected, was either fabricated or had been given by someone who had seen a black woman in a good blazer sitting alone in a restaurant they considered their territory and had decided, without articulating it even to themselves, that something about it required correction. "Ma'am, if you could just—" "I have answered your question," she said. "Is there something else?" There was in fact something else. Furness had a supervisor named Craig Bellamy who had told him, on more than one occasion, and in language that was careful enough to be deniable, to trust his instincts about guests who seemed out of place. Craig Bellamy had been working hotel security in Ottawa for 11 years, and had developed, alongside Dale Furness, the same finely tuned and deeply flawed instinct. And Craig Bellamy was now standing at the entrance to the dining room, watching. "I'm going to have to ask you to come with me to the front desk," Furness said, louder this time. "Or I'm going to need to contact Ottawa Police Service." The words landed in the dining room like something dropped from a height. The sommelier, who had been approaching with a bottle meant for the table near the window, stopped walking. The maitre de Martin Pelchat looked up from the reservation stand with an expression that shifted rapidly from surprise to alarm to a specific shade of professional horror. And from the arched entrance on the far side of the dining room, the footsteps that had been approaching paused for exactly 2 seconds before resuming at a different pace entirely. Brigadier-General Thibodeau-Marsh had just returned from the lobby, where she had spent the last 12 minutes on a phone call with the Chief of the Defence Staff. She was 61 years old, grey-haired and dressed in civilian clothes, a dark wool blazer, and tailored trousers because she had been at a private reception at the Governor-General's residence earlier in the evening and had not changed. She wore no uniform. She wore no insignia. What she wore, unmistakably, to anyone who had ever been in a room with someone who held genuine authority, was the absolute and undeniable bearing of a person accustomed to being the most consequential individual present. She had invited Lieutenant Colonel Osei-Wentworth to dinner. She had been Adaora's commanding officer for 3 of the most operationally demanding years of either woman's career. And she had watched Adaora Osei-Wentworth perform under conditions that would have broken officers half again her size. Thibodeau-Marsh had a long memory and a precise sense of what she was looking at. What she was looking at right now was Dale Furness. She crossed the dining room without hurrying. She did not need to hurry. When she came to a stop beside Furness, she was close enough that he had to turn to address her, which put his back, involuntarily, to the rest of the room. "What is the nature of the complaint?" she asked. Her French-Canadian accent was mild and precise, like her vowels had been measured. Furness blinked. "Ma'am, this is a security matter. I need to ask." "I heard what you asked," Thibodeau-Marsh said. "I am asking you what the specific complaint was. Who made it? What did they report? And what is the physical description they provided?" Something shifted behind Furness's eyes. The woman in front of him was not raising her voice. She was not threatening him. She was asking him a procedural question in a tone that made it absolutely clear she expected a procedural answer, and the complete absence of any emotion in her voice was somehow more unnerving than anger would have been. "A guest in the East Corridor reported a woman matching what description specifically?" Thibodeau-Marsh said. Furness opened his mouth, closed it. "Female," he said finally. "Dark complexion, professional dress." The dining room had gone the kind of quiet that a room goes when everyone in it has understood something at exactly the same moment, and no one wants to be the first to react. Thibodeau-Marsh looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached into her blazer and produced a card. She set it on the table beside Adaora's wine glass. "That is my name and rank," she said. "You will note that I am a Brigadier General in the Canadian Armed Forces, and that Lieutenant Colonel Osei-Wentworth is my guest this evening. We are both on active duty status. You have just threatened to contact Ottawa Police Service, based on a complaint whose sole descriptive criteria, by your own account, was the colour of a person's skin and the quality of their clothing." She paused. "I need you to understand something very clearly. I am about to call the general manager of this hotel. I am also going to call the Chief of the Defence Staff, with whom I was speaking in your lobby 6 minutes ago. And I am going to recommend, formally and in writing, that the Canadian Armed Forces review its relationship with this establishment as an accommodation provider for personnel visiting Ottawa on federal business." Furness stared at the card. "That's," he started. "That will be all," Thibodeau-Marsh said. She did not sit down immediately. She turned to the maitre d', Martin Pelchat, who had arrived at the edge of the scene with the expression of a man who had just watched someone walk directly into a concrete wall. "Martin," she said, "would you please ask the manager to come out? There's something that needs to be addressed." Pelchat was already moving. Adaora Osei-Wentworth, who had not spoken in 3 minutes, picked up her wineglass and took a measured sip. She looked at Furness with the expression she reserved for logistics reports that had been submitted with fundamental errors in the underlying data. Not angry precisely, but deeply, professionally unimpressed. "You chose the wrong table," she said quietly, "and the wrong night." Furness took a step backward, then another. He looked at the card still sitting on the white linen tablecloth, then at the two women who were now watching him with the patient, unblinking calm of people who have survived things he would never understand, and he felt, for the first time in 4 years of doing this job, genuinely afraid. Not of being fired, of having been wrong in a way that could not be undone or explained away or quietly buried. The manager arrived in under 3 minutes. Her name was Sylvie Archambault, and she had been with the hotel for 16 years and had spent most of those years managing exactly this kind of situation. The aftermath of a failure, the particular mess that accumulated when someone on her staff had acted on instinct rather than judgment. She took one look at the card on the table, at Dale Furness, standing 2 feet away from it, like a man waiting for a verdict, and at the two women seated with the composure of people who had already decided exactly what was going to happen next, and she understood immediately and completely what had occurred. "Brigadier General," she said, "I am deeply sorry. Please allow me." "I would like," Thibodeau-Marsh said, "a full account of the complaint that initiated this. Who made it, when it was logged, and what it said. I would also like to know whether your security protocols instruct staff to verify complaints before acting on them, or whether Mr. Furness was operating within your standard procedure." Archambault swallowed. "I will look into this personally tonight." "I'd appreciate that," Thibodeau-Marsh said. "And I would appreciate it if you also looked into whether this type of complaint has been raised previously about guests in this dining room. I suspect Lieutenant Colonel Osei-Wentworth is not the first." She wasn't. The inquiry that Sylvie Archambault quietly initiated that night, cross-referencing security incident logs with reservation records and dining complaint histories over the previous 3 years, surfaced a pattern that was not subtle once you knew to look for it. 7 incidents. 7 complaints logged against guests in the main dining room or the East Corridor. Every single complainant had been white. Every single subject of the complaint had been black or indigenous. In 5 of the 7 cases, the complaints had noted professional dress and solo seating as factors. Not once had any of the subjects been found to have done anything wrong. In 3 cases, they had simply been seated at a table, alone, eating a meal. In none of the 7 cases had a security guard been disciplined. Craig Bellamy, Dale Furness's supervisor, had authorized 4 of the 7 responses. By the time the sun came up over the Rideau Canal the next morning, Sylvie Archambault had written 2 letters, one to Brigadier-General Thibodeau-Marsh and one to Craig Bellamy, informing him that his employment with the hotel was terminated effective immediately, pending review. Dale Furness was suspended without pay, pending a full investigation. The complaint files were forwarded to the hotel's legal team and to an external equity consultant who had been recommended by the hotel's ownership group the previous year and never actually retained. They retained her the following Monday. At CFB Trenton, Lieutenant Colonel Adaora Osei-Wentworth boarded her flight as scheduled. She had submitted a formal written account of the incident to the chain of command, as regulations required, and she had done so with the same clear, factual precision she brought to every report she had ever written in 22 years of service. No embellishment, no editorializing. Just what happened, in order, with times and names and what was said. It was, her reporting officer later observes, one of the clearest accounts of a civil rights incident he had ever read. Brigadier-General Thibodeau-Marsh's formal letter to the hotel's parent company was 4 paragraphs long. It documented the incident, referenced the complaint pattern uncovered by Archambault's internal audit, and outlined the specific ways in which the hotel's security culture had enabled and normalized discriminatory conduct. It did not threaten, it did not demand, it simply stated what had happened and what, in the Brigadier General's assessment, needed to change. Then it was copied to the Office of the Minister of National Defense, the Chief of the Defense Staff, and the Federal Ombudsman for the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces. Within 2 weeks, the department had issued a memorandum suspending the hotel's status as a preferred accommodation provider for personnel traveling on federal business, pending a satisfactory review of its equity and security practices. The hotel lost 11% of its federal accommodation bookings within the first month. The parent company reached out to Brigadier-General Thibodeau-Marsh's office through a lawyer. She did not take the call. She was, at the time, in a briefing room at NDHQ preparing a logistics presentation for the Chief of the Defense Staff, and she didn't the matter unfinished. The matter was finished. The people responsible for it were either gone or suspended. The pattern had been documented and disclosed, and the systems that had enabled it were being reviewed by people whose job it was to fix them. Dale Furness's disciplinary investigation concluded 6 weeks after the incident. The finding was that he had acted on a complaint that did not meet the threshold for intervention under the hotel's own security protocols, that he had escalated unnecessarily to a threat of police involvement, and that his conduct had constituted harassment on the basis of race. His employment was terminated. He was, at 31 years old, required to explain in every subsequent job application why he had been dismissed from his last position. Craig Bellamy's case took longer. The investigation found that his informal guidelines to his guests to trust their instincts about guests who seemed out of place had, over the course of 4 years, functioned as a standing instruction to act on racial bias. It was not written down. It had never been formally articulated. But it was there, consistent and traceable, in the pattern of 7 incidents across 36 months. His termination was upheld on review. What stayed with Sylvie Archambault, long after the legal letters and the consultant's report and the policy revisions, was a detail from Lieutenant Colonel Osei-Wentworth's written account. At the moment Dale Furness's hand came down on her shoulder, Adaora had been reviewing the final logistical checklist for a training exercise involving 400 personnel. She had 48 hours between a classified briefing and a flight to a base where people were counting on her to have done exactly that work. She had chosen Wilfrid's because it was quiet and close, and she had eaten there twice before without incident. She had been trying to finish her salmon and her checklist, that was all. The scale of what one person's unchecked bias had interrupted, the operational weight of the work it had reached into and disrupted, was not something that appeared in any of the formal documents. But Archambault thought about it. She thought about it every time she walked through the dining room, every time a guest sat down at table 14. Power, the genuine kind, rarely announces itself. It does not need to. It simply exists quietly in the work being done and the responsibility being carried and the decisions being made by people who do not stop doing those things just because someone with a lesser understanding of the world has decided, based on nothing more than the evidence of their own prejudice, that they do not belong in the room. Lieutenant Colonel Adaora Osei-Wentworth finished her checklist on the flight to Trenton. The exercise went as planned. If this story of quiet authority, institutional accountability, and the kind of justice that doesn't arrive with applause, but with paperwork and consequences and permanent change resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that the scales always, eventually, find their balance. Subscribe to Sounds of Justice, and stay with us. There are more stories where this one came from, and not one of them lets the wrong side win.